The gunshot echoed across the canyon as Sarah Holland's stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, throwing her against the worn leather seat while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Dust billowed through the windows as three masked riders surrounded the coach, their weapons gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun of southern Utah's Red Rock country. It was September 1878, and Sarah had been traveling from her brother's funeral in Salt Lake City back to the ranch where she worked as a governess, her entire life packed into a single leather trunk strapped to the coach's roof. Everyone out. The lead rider's voice was muffled behind a dirty bandana, but the threat in his tone needed no clarification. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the dusty trail, her eyes scanning the barren landscape for any sign of help. The driver, an older man named Tom, stood with his hands raised, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the coach frame. The second rider dismounted and climbed atop the stagecoach, methodically throwing luggage to the ground. Sarah watched in horror as her trunk landed with a heavy thud, the brass clasps glinting in the sunlight. Everything she owned was in that trunk: her mother's wedding dress, the few photographs she had of her family, the small inheritance of jewelry her brother had left her, and the letters she had written but never sent to anyone who might care. "Please," Sarah heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "That trunk contains items of sentimental value. You can take the jewelry, but I beg you to leave the rest." The lead rider turned his horse toward her, and she could see his eyes narrow above the bandana. "Ain't no begging going to change nothing, miss. We take what we want." The third rider had been rifling through the mail pouch when he suddenly stiffened, looking toward the eastern ridge. "We got company coming. We need to move now." Without another word, they grabbed what they could carry, including Sarah's trunk, which two of them hoisted onto a pack horse. Within moments, they were thundering away toward the maze of canyons that led deeper into the wilderness, leaving Sarah and Tom in a cloud of settling dust. Tom lowered his hands slowly, touching the wound on his head. "You all right, Miss Holland?" Sarah nodded, though her throat felt tight with unshed tears. She had survived worse than this: her parents' death from cholera when she was 16, her brother's recent passing from consumption, the loneliness of being utterly alone in the world at 23. But somehow, watching those men ride away with the physical remnants of her past felt like losing her family all over again. "We are 5 miles from the Double Diamond Ranch," Tom said, squinting at the sun's position. "Owner is Dalton Wheeler. Good man. He will help us get word to the marshal in Tropic." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she had little choice. They began the long walk toward the ranch, the September heat beating down on them relentlessly. The landscape around them was breathtaking in its harshness, towering red cliffs carved by centuries of wind and rain, sagebrush dotting the sandy soil, and the distant purple mountains that seemed to shimmer in the heat haze. They had walked perhaps 2 miles when Sarah heard the thunder of hooves behind them. She turned, fear spiking through her chest, but instead of the bandits returning, she saw a lone rider approaching at a gallop. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall man astride a buckskin horse, his dark hat pulled low against the sun. The rider slowed as he reached them, and Sarah found herself looking up into a face that was sun-weathered and strong, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with an air of quiet competence that came from years of hard living. "Tom," the man said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "What happened here?" "Ambushed Dalton. 3 riders masked, took everything including Miss Holland's trunk. They headed west into the canyon country maybe 20 minutes ago." So this was Dalton Wheeler. Sarah watched as his gray eyes swept over the scene, taking in Tom's injury and her disheveled appearance with a quick, assessing glance. When his gaze met hers, something flickered in his expression, concern perhaps, or recognition of shared hardship. "How bad are you hurt, Tom?" Dalton asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to match the landscape around them. "Just a scratch. Miss Holland here, she asked them to leave her trunk. They took it anyway." Dalton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What was in the trunk, if I may ask?" Sarah lifted her chin, trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. "Family belongings, photographs, letters, my mother's wedding dress, some jewelry my brother left me." "Nothing that would mean much to anyone but me." Something in his expression softened. "That means everything, then." He turned to Tom. "Can you make it back to the ranch with Miss Holland? I am going after those men." "Dalton, there are 3 of them," Tom protested. "You should wait for help. Trail will be cold by then. Besides, I have tracked men through worse country than this." He swung back into his saddle, then looked down at Sarah. "I will bring your trunk back, Miss Holland. You have my word." Before she could respond, he wheeled his horse around and was galloping in the direction the bandits had taken, leaving her staring after him with a strange mixture of hope and concern tightening in her chest. Tom touched her elbow gently. "Come on, miss. Dalton Wheeler is the best tracker in 3 counties. If anyone can get your belongings back, it is him." They continued their walk toward the Double Diamond Ranch, and Tom filled the silence with stories about his employer. Dalton Wheeler had inherited the ranch from his father 3 years ago, after the elder Wheeler had been killed in a dispute with cattle rustlers. At 27, Dalton had transformed the struggling operation into one of the most successful ranches in southern Utah, earning respect through hard work and fair dealing. He was known for his skill with horses, his uncanny ability to track anything that moved across the desert, and his unwavering sense of honor. "Never married?" Sarah found herself asking, then felt her cheeks warm at her own boldness. Tom chuckled. "Too busy keeping the ranch going, I reckon." Though plenty of young ladies in Tropic have tried to catch his eye, he is not much for socializing, keeps to himself mostly, except when it comes to helping folks in need. Like now. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a valley where a creek cut through the red earth. The main house was built of stone and timber, sturdy and practical rather than ornate. Corrals held several dozen horses, and Sarah could see cattle grazing in the distance where the valley widened. A woman in her 50s came out to meet them, her face creased with worry when she saw Tom's injury. "Good Lord, what happened?" "Bandits, Martha," Tom explained. "Dalton went after them." Martha, who turned out to be the ranch housekeeper, tutted disapprovingly but ushered them both inside. She cleaned Tom's wound while firing questions at him, then turned her attention to Sarah. "You poor dear, you look exhausted. Let me get you some water and something to eat. You can rest in the guest room until Dalton returns." Sarah wanted to protest, but the long walk in the heat had left her light-headed and weary. She allowed Martha to lead her to a simple but comfortable room, accepted a pitcher of cool water and some bread with butter, and sat on the edge of the bed trying not to think about Dalton Wheeler facing 3 armed men alone. The sun was setting when she finally heard the sound of horses in the yard. Sarah rushed to the window and saw Dalton riding in, her leather trunk secured behind his saddle. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by concern when she noticed the way he held his left arm close to his body. She hurried downstairs and reached the porch just as Martha came out. Dalton was dismounting carefully, and in the fading light, Sarah could see blood on his sleeve. "You are hurt," she said. the words coming out more sharply than she intended. He looked up at her, and despite the obvious pain, there was something almost like amusement in his eyes. Just a graze. One of them got off a lucky shot before I convinced them to give up your belongings. Convince them, Martha said skeptically, hands on her hips. Tracked them to their camp in Bryce Canyon. They were not expecting anyone to follow them that far. I explained that the trunk belonged to a lady who had already lost enough in her life, and they saw the wisdom in returning it. His tone was mild, but Sarah noticed his knuckles were bruised and there was a cut on his lip that had not been there before. Martha huffed. More like you beat the sense into them. Come inside and let me look at that arm. The trunk first, Dalton said, untying it with his good hand. He carried it to the porch and set it down in front of Sarah with surprising gentleness. I believe this belongs to you, Miss Holland. Sarah knelt beside the trunk, her fingers trembling as she opened the clasps. Everything was there: the folded white dress, the small wooden box containing her mother's jewelry, the bundle of letters tied with ribbon, the photographs in their silver frames. Her vision blurred with tears she had been holding back all day. Thank you, she whispered, looking up at him. You did not have to do this. You risked your life for things that mean nothing to anyone but me. Dalton crouched down beside her, wincing slightly at the movement. That is exactly why I had to do it. The things that mean everything to us are worth fighting for, even if nobody else understands. His voice was quiet, meant only for her, and when their eyes met, Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or the beginning of something she had not felt in a very long time. Martha broke the moment by clearing her throat loudly. Dalton Wheeler, if you do not get yourself inside this instant, I will drag you in myself. That arm needs tending. He stood with a slight smile and offered Sarah his good hand to help her up. His grip was strong and calloused from hard work, and Sarah was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin against hers. Inside, while Martha fussed over Dalton's wound, which proved to be a bullet graze along his upper arm, painful but not serious, Sarah learned more of the story. He had tracked the three men for 12 miles through increasingly difficult terrain, finally cornering them in a narrow canyon where they had stopped to divide their loot. The confrontation had been brief, but violent. Dalton had managed to disarm the first man before the second got off a shot that grazed his arm. The third had tried to run but had not made it far. Did you kill them? Sarah asked quietly, not sure what answer she wanted to hear. No, Dalton said, holding still while Martha wrapped his arm with clean bandages. Left them tied up for the marshal to collect. They will face justice in a courtroom, not at the end of a gun, not if I can help it. That night, Sarah lay in the guest room unable to sleep, her mind replaying the events of the day. She thought about Dalton's determination to recover her belongings, the way he had risked himself for a woman he had never met before. Most men she had known would have considered a few photographs and letters not worth the danger. But he had understood, somehow, what those items represented: connection, history, proof that she had been loved and had belonged somewhere once. In the morning, Martha informed her that the stagecoach wheel had been damaged during the robbery and would need repair. It would be at least 2 days before Sarah could continue to the ranch where she was employed. Dalton, over breakfast, insisted she stay at the Double Diamond as his guest. I will not hear of you staying at the boarding house in town, he said firmly. You have been through enough without being put out. Besides, Martha enjoys the company. Martha beamed. That I do. It gets lonely around here with just men stomping through. You will stay, dear, and that is final. Sarah found she had no desire to argue. The ranch was peaceful in a way she had not experienced in years, and there was something about Dalton's quiet presence that made her feel safe for the first time since her brother's death. Over the next 2 days, Sarah found herself drawn into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Martha in the kitchen, learning to make biscuits the way the older woman's mother had taught her in Missouri. She walked along the creek that ran through the property, watching the water catch the sunlight as it tumbled over smooth stones. She met the ranch hands, a mix of weathered cowboys and younger men learning the trade, and saw the respect they had for Dalton, how they worked harder when he was watching, not out of fear, but out of a desire to meet his standards. And she watched Dalton himself, though she tried to be subtle about it. He was up before dawn each morning, checking on the horses and cattle, riding the fence lines, working alongside his men to repair a damaged corral. Despite his injured arm, he never stopped moving, never asked anyone to do something he would not do himself. But she also saw the gentleness in him, the way he handled a skittish yearling with patience and soft words, the way he listened when one of the younger ranch hands came to him with a problem. On the second evening, Dalton found her sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the red cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, and she shook her head, moving over to make room on the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the air cooling rapidly as it always did in the desert once the sun began to set. Sarah was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "Tom told me you lost your brother recently," Dalton said finally. "I am sorry for your loss. Thank you. He was all the family I had left." Sarah twisted her hands in her lap. "Consumption took him, just like it took our mother. Our father died of cholera the same year she did. Michael raised me from the time I was 16, and now he is gone too." "That is a heavy burden to carry alone," Dalton said quietly. "When my father died, I thought I would drown in the responsibility of keeping this place running. There were days I was not sure I could do it. But you did. I had to. It was his legacy, and I could not let it die with him." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "But it was lonely. Still is sometimes. Running a ranch, keeping everything going, it does not leave much time for anything else." Sarah understood what he was not saying. "You never thought about marrying?" "Surely there are women who would be happy to be a rancher's wife." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I have met plenty of women who like the idea of being married to a man who owns land, but I have not met many who understand what it really means, the hard work, the uncertainty, the isolation. My mother loved my father, but she hated this life. She died when I was 10, and I think part of what killed her was loneliness." The honesty in his words touched something deep inside Sarah. "What would you want in a wife, then, if you could choose?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Someone who understands that nothing worth having comes easy. Someone who would not run when times get hard. Someone who could find beauty in this landscape instead of just seeing emptiness." He paused, then added softly, "Someone who knows what it means to fight for what matters." Their eyes met, and Sarah felt her breath catch. There was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. "I should check on the horses," Dalton said abruptly, standing, but he hesitated, looking down at her. "I am glad you are safe, Sarah. I am glad I could help." He had used her first name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her. "I am glad too, Dalton." After he left, Sarah sat on the porch until the stars came out, bright and infinite in the clear desert sky. She thought about what he had said, about what he wanted, and realized with a start that she could be that woman. She had never run from hardship. She had survived loss after loss and kept going. And this landscape, which might seem harsh and empty to some, felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. The next morning, The stagecoach was repaired and ready to continue to the ranch where Sarah was expected. She packed her trunk with Martha's help, moving slowly because neither of them seemed eager for her to leave. Dalton insisted on accompanying her in his wagon, saying the stagecoach company owed him nothing and he wanted to make sure she arrived safely. Tom drove the wagon while Dalton rode alongside on his buckskin horse, and Sarah found herself watching him more than the landscape. The ranch where she was to work as a governess turned out to be a sprawling operation run by a family named Morrison. Mrs. Morrison, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, greeted Sarah with professional courtesy but little warmth. She had 3 children who needed education, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, and a girl of 6. The position would provide room and board plus a small salary, and Sarah would be expected to teach the children reading, writing, arithmetic, and deportment. As Mrs. Morrison showed Sarah to the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, Sarah felt a strange heaviness in her chest. This was a good position, better than she might have found elsewhere. She should be grateful. But as she glanced out the window and saw Dalton talking to Tom by the wagon, she felt an unexpected surge of panic at the thought of him leaving. She excused herself and hurried outside, catching Dalton as he was preparing to mount his horse. "Wait," she said breathlessly. "I wanted to thank you properly, for everything you did." He turned, and the look in his eyes made her heart skip. "You do not need to thank me, Sarah." "Yes, I do. You risked your life for my belongings. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. You showed me kindness when I needed it most." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "Will I see you again?" The question hung in the air between them. Dalton stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Would you want to?" he asked quietly. "Yes." The word came out without hesitation, and she saw something flare in his expression, hope perhaps, or relief. "Then you will. Tropic is not far from here. I go into town most Saturdays for supplies. If you have a day off, maybe you could meet me there. We could have lunch at the hotel restaurant." Sarah felt a smile spread across her face. "I would like that very much." "Saturday, then. Noon at the hotel." He reached out and took her hand, holding it for a moment longer than propriety dictated. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both innocent and intimate. Then he released her, tipped his hat, and swung into his saddle. Sarah watched him ride away until he disappeared around a bend in the road, her hand still tingling from his touch. The week that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. She threw herself into her new position, assessing the children's education levels and developing lesson plans. The boys, Jacob and Thomas, were bright but prone to mischief. Little Emma was shy but eager to learn. Mrs. Morrison ran her household with military precision and expected Sarah to maintain the same standards in the schoolroom. Mr. Morrison was frequently away on cattle business and barely acknowledged Sarah when he was home. But through it all, Sarah found her thoughts returning to Dalton. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he promised to bring back her trunk, the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke about his father's legacy, the warmth in his eyes when he asked if she wanted to see him again. On Saturday morning, Sarah dressed in her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and asked Mrs. Morrison for the afternoon off. The older woman raised an eyebrow but granted permission, reminding Sarah that she was expected back by 6 o'clock for supper preparation. Sarah took the ranch's buckboard into Tropic, arriving at the small town just before noon. The settlement was typical of southern Utah, a scattering of buildings along a dusty main street, dominated by a general store, a church, a saloon, and a modest hotel. The red cliffs loomed over everything, a reminder of the wild landscape that surrounded this tiny outpost of civilization. Dalton was waiting on the hotel porch, dressed in clean clothes with his dark hair still damp from washing. When he saw her, his face lit up in a way that made Sarah's stomach flutter. "You came," he said, helping her down from the buckboard. "Did you think I would not? I hoped you would. But hoping and knowing are different things." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The hotel restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and a menu that offered beef steak, chicken, and trout from the local streams. They ordered and then sat looking at each other across the table, both suddenly shy. "How is the new position?" Dalton asked finally. "Challenging but good. The children are sweet, though the boys test me at every opportunity. Mrs. Morrison runs a tight household." Sarah paused. "It is a good situation, I should be grateful." But she met his eyes, surprised by his perception. "But it feels temporary somehow. Like I am waiting for something else, only I do not know what." Dalton leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the day we met. I know it has only been a week, and I know you have just started a new position. But I would like to court you properly, if you are willing. I would like to get to know you better and see where this might lead." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I have been thinking about you too," she admitted. "When I watch the sunset from the Morrison Ranch, I remember sitting on your porch and talking about what matters in life. When I see the red cliffs in the morning, I think about you riding through that landscape to help someone you had never met. Then you will let me court you?" "Yes." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Yes, Dalton. I would like that very much." His fingers intertwined with hers, and for a moment the rest of the restaurant faded away. There was only the two of them. Two people who had found each other against all odds, in the middle of the harsh and beautiful wilderness of southern Utah. Their food arrived, and they ate while talking about everything and nothing: his plans for expanding the ranch's horse breeding program, her memories of growing up in St. Louis before her parents died, the books they had read, the dreams they had put aside when life demanded practical choices. Sarah discovered that Dalton had a quiet sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, and that he listened to her with complete attention, as if her words were the most important thing in the world. After lunch, they walked down the main street of Tropic, drawing curious glances from the townspeople who knew Dalton and were clearly interested in his companion. He ignored the attention, pointing out various buildings and sharing bits of local history. When they reached the end of the street, where the buildings gave way to open land, they stood looking out at the vast landscape. "I meant what I said about finding beauty here," Dalton said. "Most people see this country and think it is too hard, too dry, too empty. But I see the way the light changes the color of the cliffs every hour. I see how tough the plants are, surviving in conditions that would kill anything softer. I see wild horses running free and eagles riding the thermals. This place demands respect, but it gives back if you know how to listen." Sarah looked up at him. "You love it here." "I do. I know that limits my choices in some ways. I could never leave, not permanently. This land is in my blood." "I would not want you to leave," Sarah said softly. "I think I understand what you mean about listening to this place. It is teaching me things I did not know I needed to learn." He turned to face her fully, reaching up to tuck a loose strand of her dark hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, intimate, and Sarah leaned into his touch without thinking. "I am going to kiss you now," Dalton said quietly. "If that is not what you want, tell me and I will stop." Sarah's answer was to rise on her toes and close the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and Sarah felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I have never felt this way before," he admitted. "I was starting to think I never would." "Neither have I," Sarah whispered. "I thought I was meant to be alone." "You are not alone anymore. Whatever happens, whatever we face, you are not alone." They stood there in the afternoon sunlight, holding each other, while the desert wind whispered around them, and the red cliffs stood as silent witnesses to the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Every Saturday, weather permitting, Sarah would make the trip into Tropic and meet Dalton. Sometimes they would have lunch at the hotel. Other times they would take a picnic and ride out to some beautiful spot. Dalton wanted to show her a hidden canyon with ancient pictographs on the walls, a grove of cottonwoods where a spring created a small oasis, a ridge where they could see for miles in every direction. They talked about everything. Dalton told her about his childhood, about a mother who had tried to bring Eastern refinement to the rough territory and had wilted under the effort, about a father who had loved the land more than anything except his son. Sarah shared memories of happier times before illness had stolen her parents, of her brother's determination to give her a good education even when money was scarce, of the loneliness that had dogged her steps even when she was surrounded by people. But they also built new memories. Dalton taught her to ride better, correcting her seat with patient instruction until she felt confident cantering across the open desert. Sarah made him laugh with her observations about the Morrison children and her attempts to teach Emma proper needlework, when the little girl would rather be outside climbing trees. They discovered a shared love of poetry. Dalton had a worn copy of Whitman that had been his mother's, and Sarah could recite Longfellow from memory. The physical side of their relationship developed slowly, sweetly. Dalton was always respectful, never pushing for more than Sarah was ready to give. But their kisses grew longer and more passionate. His hands learned the curve of her waist, the softness of her hair. She discovered the pleasure of running her fingers through his hair, of feeling the solid strength of his shoulders beneath her palms. One Saturday in late October, Dalton arrived in Tropic with a serious expression that immediately put Sarah on alert. "What is wrong?" she asked as soon as they were alone. He took her hands in his. "Nothing is wrong exactly, but I need to talk to you about something important." He led her to a bench outside the general store. "Sarah, we have been courting for 6 weeks now. I know that is not very long by some standards, but at our age, I do not see the point in waiting when I know what I want." Sarah's heart began to race. "What do you want?" "I want you to be my wife." The words came out in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing them. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you, raise children if God blesses us with them, grow old watching the sunset from our porch. I know I am not offering an easy life. The ranch is demanding and there will be hard times. But I promise I will work every day to make you happy. I promise I will stand by you no matter what comes. I promise I will love you for the rest of my life." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Dalton, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she did not care. When he finally released her enough to kiss her, it was with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings. "I do not have a ring yet," he said when they came up for air. "I wanted to ask you first, make sure you would say yes before I presumed." Sarah stopped him with another kiss. "I do not need a ring right now. I just need you." They made plans sitting on that bench, heedless of the curious stares from passing townspeople. They would marry in December, giving Sarah time to finish out her commitment to the Morrisons through the end of the year. Dalton would speak to the minister in Tropic about performing the ceremony. They would have a small wedding, just a few close friends and ranch hands, Martha as witness. Maybe Tom to give Sarah away since she had no family. When Sarah returned to the Morrison ranch that evening, she gave her notice. Mrs. Morrison was not pleased, but she could hardly object to Sarah leaving to marry. She agreed to let Sarah stay through December, giving her time to find a replacement. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Martha threw herself into planning with enthusiasm, insisting on sewing Sarah a new dress for the wedding. Dalton rode into town twice to order supplies for improvements to the ranch house: a new stove for the kitchen, fabric for curtains, a brass bed frame that made Sarah blush when she saw it. He also took her to meet the few neighbors who lived within riding distance. The closest was the Johansson family, whose ranch bordered the Double Diamond to the south. They had 3 grown sons and a daughter named Lily, who was close to Sarah's age. Lily welcomed Sarah warmly, clearly delighted that Dalton was finally settling down. "I was beginning to think he would stay a bachelor forever," Lily confided when the men were outside looking at cattle. "He is a good man, Sarah. He deserves to be happy, and I can see he is happy with you." Sarah met Dalton's banker in Tropic, a shrewd older man named Henderson who managed the ranch's accounts. He seemed pleased that Dalton was marrying, commenting that a wife would provide stability. "Not that Dalton needs steadying," Henderson said with a chuckle. "But it is good for a man to have someone to come home to. Makes him think about the future differently." A week before the wedding, Dalton took Sarah to the ranch house and asked her opinion on where to put furniture, which rooms should be bedrooms for the children they both hoped would come, whether she wanted chickens near the house or down by the barn. Sarah realized he was not just asking for her opinion, he was making it clear that this would be her home, not just his, and her voice mattered. That evening, as they stood in what would be their bedroom looking out at the darkening landscape, Dalton wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "It is not too late to change your mind." Sarah leaned back against his chest. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Dalton Wheeler." It was the first time either of them had said the words aloud, though they had been understood for weeks. She felt him tense, then relax, his arms tightening around her. "I love you too, Sarah Holland. I think I have loved you since the moment you looked up at me with tears in your eyes and thanked me for bringing back your trunk. You have brought joy into my life that I did not know I was missing." They stood there until the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, talking quietly about the future they would build together. The wedding took place on a cold but clear December morning in the small church in Tropic. Sarah wore the dress Martha had made, a simple but elegant design in cream-colored wool, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had been salvaged from her mother's wedding dress. She carried a small bouquet of dried wildflowers that Lily had prepared. Tom walked her down the aisle, tears in his weathered eyes. Dalton waited at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his gray eyes never leaving her face as she approached. The minister, a kind man named Reverend Collins, performed a simple but moving ceremony. When Dalton placed the ring on her finger, a gold band with a small sapphire that matched her eyes, Sarah's hand trembled. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and invited Dalton to kiss his bride, the kiss was tender and sweet, a promise of all the kisses to come. The reception was held at the hotel, with a meal that Martha had helped prepare. There was music from a fiddler that Tom knew, and dancing that went on until late afternoon. Sarah danced with Dalton, with Tom, with the Johansson boys, but always her eyes returned to her husband, and she found him watching her with an expression of wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real. As the sun began to set, Dalton helped her into his wagon for the ride back to the Double Diamond to their home. He had tied cans to the back of the wagon as a joke, and they rattled merrily as they drove out of town, waving to the well-wishers who had gathered to see them off. The ranch house was quiet when they arrived. Martha had tactfully taken a few days to visit her sister in Panguitch, leaving them alone. Dalton carried Sarah over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room where a fire crackled in the hearth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wheeler," he said softly. Sarah reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Take me to bed, husband." What followed was tender and passionate, awkward and beautiful in the way of first times. Dalton was patient, careful of her innocence, making sure her pleasure came before his own. Sarah discovered the joy of skin against skin, the intimacy of bodies joining, the exquisite vulnerability of giving herself completely to someone else. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the brass bed, Dalton's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder while Sarah rested her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat slow. "I did not know it could be like this," she whispered. "Neither did I," Dalton admitted. "I thought I understood what it meant to want someone, but this is different. This is everything." They made love again in the deep night, more slowly this time, learning each other's bodies with hands and mouths, whispering words of love and desire in the darkness. When Sarah finally fell asleep in her husband's arms, she dreamed of red cliffs and open sky, and a future that stretched ahead, filled with possibility. The first months of marriage brought adjustments for both of them. Sarah had to learn the rhythms of running a ranch household and to have breakfast ready for the men, how to stretch food supplies through the winter, the delicate balance of managing Martha without stepping on the older woman's toes. She learned to cook for a dozen hungry cowboys, to preserve vegetables and fruit for the lean months, to make soap and candles and all the other necessities that could not be easily purchased in remote southern Utah. But she also found unexpected joys. She loved riding out to meet Dalton when he was working in distant pastures, bringing him lunch and stealing kisses before he had to return to work. She loved the quiet evenings when it was just the two of them, reading by the fire or talking about the day's events. She loved the way he reached for her in his sleep, as if making sure she was still there. And she loved the passion they shared, the way Dalton could make her feel desired and cherished with a single heated glance across the dinner table. Dalton, for his part, flourished with Sarah by his side. The ranch hands noticed that he smiled more, that some of the weight he had carried seemed lifted. He began making plans not just for the next season, but for years ahead, expanding the horse herd, building a new barn, planting an orchard in the valley where the soil was richest. One evening in March, as they were getting ready for bed, Sarah took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. "I am with child." Dalton's expression went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, joy, wonder, fear. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I have missed 2 courses, and I have been feeling unwell in the mornings. I think our baby will come in early October." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though she could feel the answer in the way his heart raced beneath her palm. Happy does not begin to cover it. Terrified, yes. Awed, definitely, but happy most of all. He pulled back to look at her. "Are you happy?" "I am. I did not think I would ever have a family of my own again, and now I have you and soon a baby. I feel like the luckiest woman alive." They made love with exquisite tenderness that night, Dalton already protective of the tiny life growing inside her. Afterward, he talked to her belly, telling their child about the ranch, about the horses and cattle, about the red cliffs and the endless sky. Sarah ran her fingers through his hair and thought that she had never loved him more than in this moment. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring and into the summer heat. Sarah bloomed, her figure rounding, her skin glowing with health. Dalton was attentive to the point of being overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing anything too strenuous. Sarah had to remind him frequently that pregnancy was not an illness, and she was perfectly capable of continuing most of her normal activities. Martha was thrilled, already planning what to cook for the mother's strength and knitting tiny blankets in her spare time. The ranch hands were congratulatory, if a bit awkward, when Dalton announced the news. Tom claimed he had known it would happen, that a good woman was exactly what Dalton needed to make a real home. As summer faded into fall, Sarah began to prepare for the baby's arrival. She and Martha set up a nursery in the room next to the master bedroom, painting the walls a soft yellow and hanging curtains that Sarah had sewn. Lily Johansson came to visit and brought clothes her nephews had outgrown, practical items that would be useful regardless of whether the baby was a boy or girl. The doctor from Panguitch, a competent man named Dr. Freeman, visited the ranch in September to examine Sarah. He pronounced her healthy and predicted an uncomplicated delivery, though he reminded Dalton that childbirth always carried risks. "I will be here when her time comes," Dr. Freeman promised. "Just send word when the pains begin." In early October, Sarah woke in the pre-dawn darkness with a strange cramping in her lower back. She lay still for a moment, wondering if it was a false alarm, but when the cramping came again stronger, she knew. She reached over and shook Dalton's shoulder. "It is time," she said. He was instantly awake, sitting up with a wild look in his eyes. "Time, now, but the doctor. Someone needs to fetch the doctor," Sarah said, trying to stay calm even as another contraction hit. "And Martha, I need Martha." Dalton pulled on his clothes in record time and ran out to wake the ranch hands. Within minutes, Tom was riding hard toward Panguitch to fetch Dr. Freeman, and one of the younger hands was sent to bring Martha back from the main house where she had been sleeping. The labor was long and difficult, as first births often are. Sarah tried to be brave, but as the hours wore on and the pains grew stronger, she found herself crying out. Martha stayed by her side, wiping her forehead with cool cloths and murmuring encouragement. Dr. Freeman arrived just after noon and took charge, his calm competence reassuring. Dalton wanted to be in the room, but Martha shooed him out, saying childbirth was women's work and he would only be in the way. He paced the main room, driving himself and everyone else crazy with worry. Every time Sarah cried out, he flinched as if he had been struck. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, Sarah gave one final, exhausting push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. Dr. Freeman held up a tiny, squirming infant. "You have a son, Mrs. Wheeler." A healthy, beautiful boy. Sarah fell back against the pillows, exhausted but elated. Martha cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Sarah's arms. The infant had a cap of dark hair and eyes that were unfocused but appeared to be gray like his father's. He was perfect. "Let Dalton in," Sarah said. "I want him to meet his son." Martha opened the door and Dalton nearly fell into the room, his face pale and drawn. But when he saw Sarah holding their baby, his expression transformed. He crossed to the bed and sat carefully on the edge, staring down at the tiny face with wonder. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered. "He looks like you." "He has your eyes," Sarah said. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Dalton said, "What about David? David Michael, after your brother?" Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. I would like that very much. David Michael Wheeler was baptized on a bright Sunday in November, surrounded by the small community that had embraced Sarah since her arrival. As the Reverend blessed the baby, Sarah looked around at the faces gathered in the church, Martha with tears in her eyes, Tom beaming proudly, the Johansson family smiling their approval, the ranch hands standing awkwardly at the back in their Sunday best. But most of all, she looked at Dalton, who held their son with such tender care, and she felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. A little over a year ago, she had been alone in the world, heading to a position as a governess with nothing but a trunk of memories. Now she had a husband who loved her, a beautiful son, a home, and a future full of promise. The years that followed brought the usual mix of joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under Dalton's management, expanding until it was one of the largest operations in the region. Sarah proved to have a talent for horse training, working with the gentler mares and developing a breeding program for horses that were intelligent and even-tempered. She also became known for her hospitality, with the Wheeler Ranch becoming a regular stopping point for travelers heading south into Arizona. David grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who loved following his father around and trying to help with ranch work. When he was 2, Sarah became pregnant again, delivering a daughter they named Catherine in the spring of 1882. Katie, as they called her, had her mother's dark hair and delicate features, but her father's determination. The children thrived in the wide, open spaces of southern Utah. They learned to ride almost before they could walk, spent their days exploring the canyons and creeks under their parents' watchful eyes, and grew up knowing they were loved beyond measure. There were hard times, too. A drought in 1883 forced Dalton to make difficult decisions about which cattle to keep and which to sell. Sarah's friendship with Lily Johansson was a comfort when Lily lost her father to a heart attack. The winter of 1884 was brutal, with snows that isolated the ranch for weeks and took a toll on the livestock. But through it all, Sarah and Dalton's love remained steady. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when they could. They still sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the red cliffs in brilliant colors. They still talked about everything and nothing, their conversations as easy and intimate as they had been during their courtship. One Saturday evening in 1885, after the children were in bed, Sarah and Dalton sat together on that same porch bench where they had shared so many important moments. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Every detail," Dalton said, his arm around her. "You were dusty and disheveled and trying so hard to be brave. I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change. I thought you were the most capable man I had ever seen. I watched you ride away to track those bandits, and I was terrified you would not come back. But I did. I will always come back to you, Sarah." She turned to look up at him. "I know. That is one of the things I love most about you, your reliability. You are as steady as these cliffs, as enduring as the desert itself." Dalton kissed her temple. "I could not do any of this without you. You have made this house a home. You have given me a family, a reason to build something that will last beyond my lifetime. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." "We have made each other happy," Sarah corrected. "This life we have built together, it is better than anything I could have imagined that day on the stagecoach. I was heading toward what I thought was just a job, a way to survive. Instead, I found love and purpose and belonging." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Martha humming as she finished the evening dishes. In their rooms, their children slept peacefully. The ranch around them was quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the sage. In 1886, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and girl they named Daniel and Grace. The delivery was difficult, and Dr. Freeman told them afterward that Sarah should not have more children, that another pregnancy could be dangerous. Dalton, terrified by how close he had come to losing her, readily agreed. 4 children were blessing enough. The house that had once seemed spacious now rang with laughter and occasional squabbles as the children grew. David, at 7, was already showing his father's aptitude for working with animals. Katie was 6 and had inherited her mother's love of books and learning. The twins, though only toddlers, had distinct personalities. Daniel was bold and adventurous, while Grace was quieter but surprisingly stubborn. Sarah sometimes stood in the doorway of the main room and watched her family with a sense of overwhelming gratitude. Dalton teaching David how to braid a rope, Katie reading to the twins from a picture book. The afternoon light streaming through the windows. Martha had insisted on enlarging to let in more sunshine. The sounds and smells of a home filled with life and love. Martha, now in her 60s, had become more like family than an employee. She doted on the children, taught Katie to bake, and could still put ranch hands in their place with a single sharp word when needed. Tom had retired from his stage coach work, but came to visit regularly, becoming an honorary grandfather to the Wheeler children. The Johansson Ranch remained their closest neighbors and best friends. Lily had married a surveyor from Salt Lake City and had children close in age to the Wheeler kids. The families celebrated holidays together, helped each other during emergencies, and provided the social connection that kept loneliness at bay in the isolated landscape. As the children grew older, Sarah began teaching them formally, setting up a schoolroom in one of the larger bedrooms. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, geography and science. Dalton supplemented her lessons with practical knowledge: how to track animals, how to predict weather from the sky, how to survive in the wilderness if you got lost. On Saturday evenings, the family would gather in the main room for music and storytelling. Dalton had taught himself to play the guitar, and his deep voice filled the house as he sang old ballads and folk songs. Sarah would tell stories about her childhood in St. Louis, making the city come alive for children who had never seen anything larger than Tropic. The children would perform little plays they had invented, or David would demonstrate a new trick he had taught his horse. These were the moments Sarah treasured most, the ordinary, everyday magic of family life. She would catch Dalton's eye across the room and see her own contentment reflected back at her. They had built something rare and precious together, something that would endure. In 1890, when David was 11 and already tall enough to look his mother in the eye, tragedy struck the neighboring Johansson Ranch. Lily's husband was killed in a fall while surveying in the mountains. Lily was left with 3 children and a ranch to run, overwhelmed and grieving. Sarah and Dalton immediately stepped in to help. Dalton spent long days at the Johansson Ranch, managing the cattle and handling the work that Lily's husband had done. Sarah brought Lily and her children to the Double Diamond for extended visits, providing emotional support and practical help. One evening, as Sarah was putting the younger children to bed, Lily caught her hand. "I do not know how to thank you," Lily said, her eyes red from crying. "You and Dalton have been my salvation these past weeks." Sarah hugged her friend tightly. "You would do the same for us." "That is what family does. We take care of each other." "You have a good marriage, Sarah. Hold on to it. Life is so uncertain, and love is the only thing that makes sense in a senseless world." Sarah thought about those words later, lying in bed next to Dalton. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I love you," she said into the darkness. I know I tell you often, but I want you to know I never take you for granted. Every day with you is a gift." Dalton rolled toward her, pulling her close. "I love you too. You are my heart, Sarah. Everything good in my life comes back to you." They made love slowly, tenderly, a reaffirmation of the bond that had sustained them through 13 years of marriage. Afterward, Sarah lay awake listening to Dalton's breathing even out into sleep, counting her blessings and sending up silent prayers of gratitude. The 1890s brought significant changes to southern Utah. The railroad expanded, making Tropic more accessible and bringing new settlers to the region. The ranch benefited from easier access to markets, and Dalton was able to sell cattle and horses for better prices. The increased prosperity allowed them to make improvements to the property: a new barn, better irrigation for the valley, a schoolhouse in Tropic that Sarah helped establish so the local children could receive proper education. As the children entered their teenage years, Sarah and Dalton faced new challenges. David was restless, curious about the world beyond the ranch. Katie developed a passion for teaching and announced she wanted to attend the new normal school in Cedar City to become a certified teacher. The twins, now 10, were inseparable and prone to elaborate schemes that often ended in minor disasters. Through it all, Sarah and Dalton presented a united front. They talked through every major decision together, valuing each other's opinions and finding compromises when they disagreed. They had learned over the years that their marriage was the foundation on which everything else rested, and they protected it fiercely. One spring evening in 1895, as they celebrated their 19th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner after the children had gone to bed, Dalton raised his glass of wine. "To my wife," he said, "who took a chance on a lonely rancher and transformed his life. Who has given me children, built a home, and stood by my side through everything. Who still makes my heart race when she walks into a room. I love you more today than I did 19 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "To my husband, who rode into my life like a hero from a story and has been my hero every day since. Who is strong when I am weak, steady when I waver, and always, always there when I need him. You are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day that you chose me." They clinked glasses and drank. Then Dalton stood and held out his hand. "Dance with me." There was no music, but Sarah took his hand and let him pull her close. They swayed together in the quiet kitchen, the only sound their breathing and the soft shuffle of their feet on the wooden floor. Sarah rested her head on his chest and closed her eyes, memorizing this moment: the warmth of his arms, the steady beat of his heart, the peace that came from being exactly where she belonged. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Wheeler family faced the future with confidence. David, at 20, had taken on more responsibility for managing the ranch, showing the same dedication and skill his father had demonstrated. Katie was teaching at the school in Tropic and engaged to a young lawyer who had recently moved to the area. Daniel was talking about becoming a veterinarian, fascinated by animal medicine. Grace, quieter but no less determined, had announced her intention to study at the university in Salt Lake City. Sarah, now 44, found herself transitioning from active motherhood to a different role. Her children still needed her, but in different ways: for advice rather than daily care, for emotional support rather than physical tending. She had more time for her own pursuits, expanding her horse training program and becoming involved in civic improvements in Tropic. But the center of her life remained Dalton. They were entering middle age together, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work, but their love had only deepened with time. They knew each other completely now: every habit and quirk, every fear and dream, every strength and weakness. They could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, finish each other's sentences, anticipate each other's needs. One day in the summer of 1899, Sarah was working with a young mare in the corral when she looked up to see Dalton watching her from the fence. The look in his eyes, still full of desire and love after more than 20 years of marriage, made her smile. "See something you like, Mr. Wheeler?" she called out teasingly. "Always, Mrs. Wheeler. Always." She handed off the mare to one of the ranch hands and walked over to join him. He opened his arms and she stepped into them, heedless of who might be watching. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "I thought you were meeting with Henderson about the cattle contracts. Meeting finished early." "I realized I would rather spend time with my beautiful wife than discuss business." He kissed the top of her head. "Do you ever regret it, choosing this life, choosing me?" Sarah pulled back to look at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" "Sometimes I think about how different your life could have been. You were educated, cultured. You could have married someone who could give you a life of ease in a city somewhere. Instead, you got a rancher in the middle of nowhere, a life of hard work and more challenges than any woman should have to face." Sarah reached up and cupped his weathered face in her hands. "Listen to me, Dalton Wheeler. This life, right here, is exactly what I want. These red cliffs, this desert sky, this ranch, this is home. And you are not just some rancher. You are my partner, my lover, my best friend, the father of my children. You are everything I never knew I needed. I would choose you again in a heartbeat, every single time." The worry in his eyes faded, replaced by the warmth she knew so well. "I love you, Sarah. God, I love you so much. I love you too, now and always." They stood there in the afternoon sun, holding each other while the ranch hummed with activity around them, ranch hands calling to each other, horses whinnying in the corrals, the ever-present wind singing through the sage. It was an ordinary moment in an ordinary day, but it contained everything that mattered. As the new century dawned in 1900, the Wheeler family gathered to celebrate not just the turning of the calendar, but all they had accomplished together. David announced his engagement to a rancher's daughter from Panguitch. Katie was expecting her first child. The twins had both been accepted to programs that would prepare them for their chosen careers. And Sarah and Dalton, now in their 40s but still vital and strong, looked at the family they had created and the legacy they were building. The ranch would continue long after them, passed down through generations. But more than land and livestock, they were leaving a legacy of love, the kind of deep, abiding love that could weather any storm and emerge stronger. On a cool evening in March 1900, Sarah and Dalton took a rare moment alone, riding out to the ridge where Dalton had taken her on one of their first outings together. They dismounted and stood looking out over the vast landscape, painted in shades of red and gold by the setting sun. "Do you remember the first time you brought me here?" Sarah asked, leaning against him. "I remember everything about our courtship. I was terrified you would realize you could do better and leave. I was terrified you would realize I was just an ordinary woman with nothing special to offer." Dalton turned her to face him. "You were never ordinary, Sarah. From the moment you stood up to those bandits, asking them to leave your trunk, I knew you were extraordinary, and every day since has only confirmed it." Sarah smiled. "We were both fools, worrying so much. We were perfect for each other from the start. We are." He paused, then continued more seriously. "I have been thinking about something. The children are grown or nearly so. The ranch is successful beyond anything I imagined. We have built a good life. But I want to make sure you know that the best part of all of it has been you. Not the ranch, not the success, not even the children as much as I love them. You, Sarah. Loving you and being loved by you has been the greatest achievement of my life." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "Dalton, I mean it. If I died tomorrow, I would die a happy man because I have spent these years with you. You took a lonely, broken man and showed him what it means to truly live. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to get up every morning. You made me better than I ever could have been alone." Sarah threw her arms around him, holding him as tightly as she could. "You saved me too. When we met, I had lost everything. I was alone in the world, just going through the motions of surviving. You gave me a home, a family, a love I never thought I would find. You made me whole again." They stood locked in each other's arms as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and pink. The desert stretched out around them, ancient and eternal, bearing silent witness to their love. The years continued to pass in the rhythm of ranch life. There were births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks. David and his wife had 3 children and took over more of the daily ranch management, allowing Dalton to step back slightly. Katie's family grew to include 4 children, all of whom loved spending time at their grandparents' ranch. Daniel became a successful veterinarian and settled in Cedar City, while Grace surprised everyone by becoming a photographer, capturing the beauty of the southwestern landscape in stunning images. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1905, leaving a hole in the household, but also a legacy of love and service that the Wheeler family would never forget. Tom followed a year later, and Sarah wept at his funeral, remembering the kind old driver who had walked with her to the Double Diamond so many years ago. But Sarah and Dalton endured, their love the constant in a changing world. They grew older, their hair turning gray, their faces lined by sun and wind and the passage of time. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love in the wild heart of Utah. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1915, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration at the ranch. There were now 14 grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers, filling the house with noise and laughter. A photographer, Grace, using her professional skills, arranged everyone for a family portrait, with Sarah and Dalton seated in the center, surrounded by the family they had created. Later, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Sarah and Dalton retreated to their bedroom. Dalton helped her out of her dress. His hands still knew the hooks and buttons, even after 40 years, and they lay down together in the brass bed that had been part of their lives from the beginning. 40 years, Sarah murmured, nestled against his chest. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know what you mean. I can still remember exactly how I felt the day I married you, terrified and elated and so full of love I thought I would burst. I still feel that way." "So do I. You are still the man I want to wake up next to every morning. You are still the one I want to share every joy and sorrow with. You are still my heart, Dalton." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "And you are mine. Always have been, always will be." They made love slowly, gently, their aging bodies still capable of giving and receiving pleasure, still attuned to each other after decades of intimacy. Afterward, Dalton held Sarah close and they talked quietly about the day, about their children and grandchildren, about the future of the ranch. "Do you think David is ready to take over completely?" Sarah asked. "You have been talking about retiring for years." "I think so. He has good instincts and his wife is smart and capable. They will do well." Dalton paused. "I am ready, I think. Ready to step back and just enjoy what time we have left. I want to spend more time with you, travel a bit if you want, see some of the places we always talked about visiting." "I would like that," Sarah said. "We have worked so hard for so long." It would be nice to just be together with no responsibilities hanging over us. Then that is what we will do. I will talk to David tomorrow about taking over officially. You and I will start the next chapter of our lives." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "The next chapter. I like the sound of that." Dalton officially retired from running the ranch in the spring of 1916, handing over the reins to David and his wife. He and Sarah took a trip to San Francisco, marveling at the rebuilt city and the ocean that Sarah had never seen before. They traveled to St. Louis, where Sarah showed Dalton the places of her childhood, now changed almost beyond recognition. They visited the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, seeing wonders they had only read about. But always they returned to the Double Diamond, to the red cliffs and desert sky that had been the backdrop of their love story. This was home. This was where they belonged. As they entered their 70s, their health began to decline in small ways. Dalton's joints ached on cold mornings. Sarah's eyesight weakened, forcing her to wear spectacles for reading. They moved more slowly, tired more easily, but their minds remained sharp and their love remained strong. They spent their days doing simple things, tending a vegetable garden, riding out to check on the horses, playing with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sitting on the porch and watching the sunset. They spoke often of the past, remembering the day they met, their courtship, the birth of their children, the countless moments of joy and challenge that had made up their life together. One evening in the autumn of 1922, as they sat on their porch watching the sun paint the cliffs in shades of fire, Dalton took Sarah's hand. "You remember what I said to you the day we met, when I promised to bring your trunk back? You said I had your word," Sarah recalled. "And you kept it. You have always kept your word to me. I made other promises too. On our wedding day, I promised to love you for the rest of my life. I have kept that promise, Sarah. I love you as much today as I did when you were a young woman of 23. More, perhaps, because now I know every part of you, your strength and courage, your kindness and wisdom, your fierce love for our family. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You rode into my life when I had lost everything, and you gave me a reason to hope again. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You built a life with me that exceeded my wildest dreams. I could not have asked for a better partner, a better husband, a better love." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, their hands clasped together, their shoulders touching. The desert around them was quiet except for the familiar sounds they had been hearing for nearly 50 years. "I do not know how much time we have left," Dalton said quietly. "But however much it is, I want to spend every moment with you." "We will," Sarah promised. "Whatever comes, we will face it together just like we always have." And they did. Through the remaining years they were given, they remained devoted to each other. When Dalton fell ill with pneumonia in the winter of 1924, Sarah nursed him back to health with patient care. When Sarah broke her hip in a fall, Dalton carried her to bed each night and sat with her until the pain eased. They supported each other through the death of friends, celebrated the marriages and births of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and continued to find joy in the simple act of being together. On a soft evening in May 1926, 50 years after they had first met on a dusty road in southern Utah, Sarah and Dalton sat together on their porch. The ranch was thriving under David's management, now one of the most successful operations in the state. Their family had grown to include 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. They had lived to see automobiles replace horses, airplanes take to the skies, and the world change in ways they could never have imagined when they were young. But some things never changed. The red cliffs still glowed in the setting sun. The desert still spread out in vast, beautiful emptiness, and they still loved each other with a depth and constancy that had only grown stronger with time. 50 years, Sarah said wonderingly. I never imagined I would be this blessed. Dalton lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Neither did I, but I thank God every day for bringing you into my life. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Wheeler. And you were the best thing that ever happened to me, Dalton Wheeler. As the sun set on another day, painting the sky in brilliant colors, they sat together in the home they had built, surrounded by the legacy of their love. They had started with nothing but a trunk of memories and a chance meeting on a dangerous road. They had built a life filled with love, family, purpose, and joy. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they held each other close and knew that whatever the future held, they had already lived a love story that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of devotion, the strength of partnership, and the enduring beauty of two souls who had found their perfect match in the wild heart of the American West. Their children would tell the story for generations, how their mother had been ambushed 5 miles from a ranch, and how their father had tracked the bandits and brought her trunk home, and how from that act of courage and kindness had grown a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. It was a story of the Old West, of hard work and resilience, of family and legacy. But most of all, it was a story of love, the kind of love that transforms lives, that endures through every hardship, that makes two people better together than they ever could have been apart. And in the quiet of that May evening, with the desert wind whispering through the sage and the red cliffs standing eternal against the sky, Sarah and Dalton Wheeler held each other close and thanked God for the gift of 50 years together. Knowing that their love would continue to shine bright in the hearts of their family long after they had returned to the earth they loved so well.